Okay, I think I'll get us started. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this session of the Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives on International and National Affairs. This is the first session of the Spring 2025 series, and I think we have a really great program in store for you this spring. And today, this afternoon, we will focus on a new book by Isaac Stanley-Becker of the Washington Post, Europe Without Borders, a History. We're also very fortunate to have with us Emily Marker of Rutgers University, who will provide some initial comments, questions, launch our discussion. To both of you, a warm welcome to the Washington History Seminar. I'm Christian Osterman. I direct the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program, and I have the privilege to co-chair this series with Eric Arneson of George Washington University. Eric will moderate today. The Washington History Seminar is a collaborative effort of our two organizations, the American Historical Association, represented by Eric, and the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program. Since 2010, the seminar has served on a weekly basis as a nonpartisan forum to discuss important new historical publications. Behind the scenes, we need to give credit to our colleague, Peter Bierstecker, who produces this session. Thank you, Peter. We'd also like to acknowledge our supporters, welcome your support. As many of you know, this is an entirely pro bono series event, and we're always grateful for any of your contributions, financial or otherwise. How to support the organization you'll find in the chat now, or just go to our websites. Finally, join us in 2 weeks. No seminar next week due to a major event in Washington. Join us on January 27th for Malign Doubts, the First and Last King of Haiti, the Rise and Fall of Henry Christophe. With that, let me just finish on a couple of technical notes. Today's session will be recorded and will soon appear on our respective organizations' websites. You can download them and listen to them for free there. For the Q&A part of the seminar, we like to get you involved pretty soon after the discussion between our two main speakers is done. You can do so, and that's our preference, for you to use the raise hand function in Zoom, and you can join the conversation directly. You'll be queued, and the moderator, in today's case, Eric, will call on you. You'll unmute yourself and join with your comment or question. You can also use the Q&A function in Zoom, and then we'll put your comments and questions to our speakers if there is time. I think that's it. So, Eric, over to you.
Thank you, Christian. It's my pleasure to introduce our first author of the Winter-Spring 2025 season of the Washington History Seminar this afternoon. Isaac Stanley-Becker is an investigative reporter for the Washington Post who has written from across Europe and the United States. His byline has appeared on many, many articles over the past number of years. He received his BA from Yale and a PhD in history from the University of Oxford, where he studied as a Rhodes Scholar. And today he'll be speaking about his first, and I trust not last, book entitled Europe Without Borders, a History, which will officially be published tomorrow on January 14th, by Princeton University Press. Isaac, very glad to have you here this afternoon. Welcome to the seminar.
Thank you so much. I'm so thrilled to be here, and especially on the eve of the publication. I'm just so much looking forward to this discussion and to being in such interesting company. So instead of trying to do a kind of Cliff Notes version of the book, I wanted to focus on, in particular, on the themes of border security and policing in Europe and perhaps somewhat globally, depending on how the discussion goes, given the relevance of these issues to contemporary debates, and also because this aspect of the book, I think, unfurls other important themes fairly neatly. So in exploring the policing of the Schengen area of Europe, it's worth beginning with arguments set forth by authorities on European security at the end of the last century. One was a police commissioner, the other was a privacy commissioner. And from differing vantage points, each took stock of Schengen's emergence as a transnational territory of free movement. Notably, each commissioner viewed Schengen as a place of risk, and each was preoccupied by plans for what's called the Schengen Information System, a security apparatus designed to balance free movement with surveillance, to pair the lifting of physical barriers with the gathering of personal data. Consider the words of a French police commissioner, Wendelin Riblet, a member of the intergovernmental negotiating group that drafted the multilateral Schengen Accord, which was adopted in 1985 and joined by an implementing convention in 1990, finally given full effect in 1995. Quote, "Free movement does not signify the absence of control," he said. "Freedom and security are an inseparable pair. The abolition of internal borders between the member states of the Schengen Accord cannot put at risk the internal security of those states." But consider also the words of German Privacy Commissioner Thilo Weikert, a lawyer and data protection officer who went on to combat Facebook's collection of personal profiles. Schengen's rules for government processing of personal data, he wrote in 1990, were, quote, "not suitable to ensure a constitutionally required minimum standard for the protection of informational self-determination." These claims set in relief the problem I want to pose at the outset of our discussion: how Schengen, a common space conceived as a laboratory for the free movement of persons and the creation of a citizens' Europe, came to spawn a sort of transnational panopticon of the information age. My focus is on the theme of self-determination. And put simply, the idea is this: the lack of informational self-determination that put privacy at risk in Schengen represented, at bottom, a crisis of democratic self-determination. That's because Schengen created a gaping jurisdictional asymmetry, a gap between new transnational instruments of surveillance and data exchange under the information system, and enduring national sovereignty over security policy and the administration of justice. Since its inception, Schengen has been a site of dualisms, of freedom and security, but also of transnational intercourse and national governmentality. Such peculiarities were bluntly summed up soon after the Accord entered into force by none other than the director of the Schengen Secretariat, a quasi-administrative body with no substantive executive powers. Quote, "The term Schengen institution is itself a paradox," said the director. He observed that, quote, "Montesquieu would probably have a number of reasons to turn over in his grave in encountering a dynamic process like Schengen. This great tool, a tool for police cooperation and free movement, does not have institutions in the forms in which we're used to. Schengen is not presided over by a government that leads, a parliament that votes, or a court that judges," end quote. In other words, Schengen was founded as a place without government institutions, but with a powerful transnational security apparatus to offset the risks posed by free movement across the frontiers of Western Europe. Therefore, until Schengen was incorporated within the protections of EU law in 1997, it was a territory where individual freedom was acutely at risk precisely because the expansive security apparatus was subject to no countervailing transnational institutions, either guaranteeing individual self-determination or checking the police power of nation-states augmented by new information technology. From this perspective, Schengen's creation appears not simply as a Montesquieuian nightmare or as a challenge to informational privacy, but, according to foreign migrants within Citizens Europe, as a transnational project of freedom marked by, quote, "totalitarian scars." So time doesn't permit me now to trace the origins of the Schengen area and the drafting of the Accord, except in the barest of outlines. Nor can I do more than take note of the waning of the Cold War, the achievement of the internal market, the escalating fear of global terrorism, and the genesis of so-called Fortress Europe. But all gave shape to Schengen's emergence. The Schengen Agreement was adopted in June 1985 by 5 countries: France, West Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. It took its name from the village at the tri-point border of Luxembourg, France, and West Germany. There, delegates signed a treaty on free movement that expressed aspirations for both economic integration and civic solidarity, and there the implementing convention was approved 5 years later. The accord expressly stipulates that free movement within Schengen's common space is intended only for Europeans, for nationals of European Community member states. Exclusion was paired with liberty. Consider the Declaration of Aims at the 1985 signing ceremony. Schengen was, quote, a step forward on the path traced by the treaties of Rome regarding the movement of people, goods, capital, and services, a set of measures directly benefiting nationals of the European communities, bringing us closer to what is fitting to call the Europe of citizens. A pledge to prevent illegal immigration buttressed the association of free movement with European nationality. Now, the Schengen Accord does not use the language of rights, but the provisions on the abolition of controls at internal borders carried a new freedom, and although the Accord did not create a human right to cross borders, it expressly affirmed that abolishing border checks would afford, quote, free movement of persons. Schengen thus marked the advent of a new principle of freedom of movement, one that extended beyond the logic of the market and the boundaries of the nation. The Accord speaks of persons as free to cross national borders. By contrast, the Rome Treaty had allowed such mobility only to workers. For the first time, Schengen recognized persons as bearers of freedom to cross borders, not simply economic actors in a common market. A fundamental right of persons to free movement within the borders of a nation-state had been affirmed by international human rights covenants, by the Universal Declaration, and echoed by a protocol to the European Convention adopted in 1963. Notably, in 1963 as well, free movement was explicitly linked to the right of self-determination in a report by the Special Rapporteur of the UN Subcommission on the Prevention of Discrimination and Protection of Minorities. In human rights doctrine, the principle of self-determination has two meanings: for states as aspects of national anti-colonial autonomy, and for persons as aspects of the right to freedom of association and political belonging. Construing Article 13 of the Universal Declaration, which proclaims a right to freedom of movement within the borders of each state and the right of an individual to leave any country and return, the Special Rapporteur found that free movement is a, quote, right of personal self-determination and, quote, a constituent element of personal liberty. This was how Schengen's authors conceptualized free movement, as a, quote, personal freedom, that of coming and going. But the principle extended beyond the borders of the nation-state. As a French foreign minister declared, quote, at the borders, pass, pass, pass. In principle, you can pass. In the Schengen area, however, the free movement of persons was hardly uncircumscribed. Notably, the power of self-determination by crossing borders was reserved to nationals of European member states, and to Schengen states fell the authority to define the terms of national belonging within their own borders. Precisely, therefore, in limiting the bearers of free movement on the basis of nationality, Schengen rooted its transnational guarantees in long-standing precepts concerning the authority and autonomy of national communities as the spheres in which rights are exercised. Consider now the terms of the Schengen Accord, particularly the provisions for the Schengen Information System, the site where knowledge of persons was deposited, stored, and distributed to member states. While Schengen was widely recognized as a laboratory of free movement, it is less well known that it was also a laboratory for Europol, the police agency of the European Union that began limited operations in 1994. From the outset of the negotiations, diplomats understood that Schengen created a new territory of risk, that the abolition of controls at common borders posed threats to national security and to national self-determination. One compensatory measure was to fortify controls at the external perimeter of the new expanse of freedom. And above all, the aim was to stop the movement into and across the Schengen area of individuals who might threaten security, not least foreign migrants from countries listed in confidential annexes as undesirable. In 1985, the pariah countries ranged from Haiti, South Africa, and Yemen to East Germany, Poland, and China. Data was considered critical from the start. The 1985 agreement provided for, quote, exchange of information to prevent the, quote, unauthorized entry and residence of persons. But information exchange proved among the most difficult measures to formulate, not only because of divergent national policies, but also because of concerns about data privacy. Here then was the heart of the problem. A transnational information system designed to protect the security of the Schengen territory against free movement's risks threatened to trench on both national authority and individual privacy, core aspects of self-determination. A special working committee on the information system was set up in 1988. Differences in national approaches to data protection were marked. France and West Germany each had comprehensive legislation regulating police files. Luxembourg had a statement of principles, and the Netherlands was in the process of drafting a measure. But in Belgium, there were no applicable rules. As France's data protection agency warned bluntly in 1988, quote, "A French citizen arrested in Belgium will not have the right to access and rectify information concerning him in the SIS." This capacity to access and rectify information about oneself was already a central cause of privacy advocates, and notably, the cause was couched in the language of self-determination, especially in the Federal Republic, where Selbstbestimmung had entered the lexicon of privacy debates in 1983. That was the year that West Germany's constitutional court had suspended the execution of a census, finding that there was potential for abuse in the collection and processing of personal data. Listen to the words of the court. In the context of modern data processing, the protection of the individual against unlimited collection, storage, use, and disclosure of his or her personal data is encompassed by the general personal rights of the German Constitution. This basic right warrants in this respect the capacity of the individual to determine in principle the disclosure and use of his or her personal data. Limitations to this informational self-determination are allowed only in case of overriding public interest. By 1990, the creation of a shared digital file had become a condition for approval of Schengen's implementing convention. Yet agreement on data protection rules remained an obstacle, the final unresolved issue in the drafting of the convention. Epic events unfolding in Europe impinged on the negotiations. A delay was caused by the fall of the Berlin Wall and the sudden opening of borders. West Germany had obtained an assurance from its partners that citizens of the East would not be treated as foreign nationals under the convention. But the prospect of unification raised new security concerns as it pushed outward and made more permeable the eastern borders of the Schengen territory. The implementing convention was finally approved in June 1990, and it provides in great specificity for the Schengen information system, a computerized file to enhance security and policing across borders. It's termed a joint information system, in which each state creates a national section, all supported by a technical function to be based in Strasbourg. The declared aim is enabling authorities in the Schengen states, quote, "by means of an automated search process to have access to alerts on persons and property for the purpose of border and police checks," end quote. For example, any nation could issue an alert on refusing entry based on a threat to national security. The system operates according to a hit, no-hit system, meaning it allows police officials to determine if a person or object is listed in the database, and if so, it provides directions as to further action, including surveillance, refusal of entry, extradition, and seizure of goods. Now, a single article addresses individual rights and self-determination. It bans collecting certain types of data, including information revealing racial origin, political opinions, religious beliefs, and health and sexual life, and thus adheres to a 1981 Council of Europe Convention on the automatic processing of personal data. But the deference to state sovereignty is marked. The convention explicitly specifies that the right of individuals to gain access to their data files is governed by the law of each Schengen state. So too, only a nation issuing an alert is responsible for ensuring the data is accurate and lawful, and that state also has the authority to alter, correct, and delete the data. Any person seeking to correct or obtain information about themselves goes to the courts of the individual Schengen states. In the absence of transnational institutions, the protection of personal data, therefore, as information crosses borders, depends on national law. Well before Schengen entered fully into force in 1995, the security apparatus had earned the epithet European Search Union. So let's turn to the ideas of the critics, the arguments against the intrusive reach of the surveillance system mounted by data protection advocates, human rights lawyers, and undocumented immigrants. Here too, we see transnational interchange as the critiques circulated in a network of protest within the Schengen area. Again, time doesn't allow fully tracing these networks, but the argument centered on a common claim that transnational modes of surveillance could not be controlled by existing institutions, thereby eroding principles of self-government and the autonomy of individuals founded on both privacy and free movement. Consider the claims of the president of France's Human Rights League, Yves Juffat, a French Jew who evaded Nazi capture as a member of the resistance and began practicing law after the Second World War. Writing about Schengen in Le Monde in 1989, Juffat highlighted the disjuncture between the power afforded by international security techniques and the inefficacy of national legal protections in critiquing the, quote, spatial extension, or the very territorialization of police power in plans for the information system. He argued, quote, to any new power of the police, and therefore of the state, must correspond a new control capable of combating it immediately and effectively if it is wrongfully exercised, end quote. He rooted his argument in the, quote, very logic of human rights, based on the principle of, quote, no power without control, as he claimed that Schengen's security apparatus pose a risk to the principles of self-government. Quote, this is a crucial democratic issue, he wrote, adding, quote, what is an authoritarian regime, if not a regime in which the police take precedence over justice? Likewise, the director of France's Data Protection Agency warned officials in the Élysée Palace that Schengen must provide a right of digital self-determination. Quote, it is important, argued Jacques Fauvet, for public opinion to see the Schengen Agreement as creating an area of freedom more than a police area. Recognizing a right of access and rectification could help to spread this idea. Experience shows that even if this right is not exercised, it constitutes a warning that makes police services more vigilant with regard to the quality of the information recorded, end quote. Data protection, he said, quote, responds to a dual concern for the protection of individual freedom and respect for national sovereignty. His argument thus linked the two meanings of self-determination. In Germany, the data protection officer Thilo Weikert pointed to the conflict between democracy and transnational policing. Quote, democratic control of the Schengen information system is impossible. Such a Europeanization of police and prosecution conflicts with the national constitutional order, end quote. And consider the aims of a foreign migrant from one of the undesirable countries, Senegal. Hers was an outcry of the undocumented, the non-European, those who name themselves sans-papiers, without papers. Madjiguène Cissé, who had made a passage from Dakar to Saarbrücken to Paris, condemned the, quote, huge computer file, as she put it, claiming that it universalized one member state's xenophobia throughout the entire Schengen territory. In a 1999 account of the sans-papiers movement, Cissé bitterly assailed Schengen's balancing of freedom and security, claiming that the accord, quote, creates an area of free movement of goods and people, but at the same time strengthens cooperation among the states in terms of access to the common territory, end quote. Less than a decade after Schengen's entry into force, a network of no-border activists traveled from across Europe to Strasbourg, the headquarters of the Schengen information system, to mount protests against the operation of data-enhanced surveillance. Their claims were not recognized by any national authority or vindicated by international institutions. But in the future of free movement within the Schengen territory, everyday denizens of Citizens Europe saw risks to self-determination that would go unchecked if democratic institutions were overpowered by a transnational security system. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Isaac. Before we continue, let me note to those in the audience, you can queue up now if you have questions. As Christian explained at the outset, you can use the raise hand function, our preferred method, in which case I call on you and you get to pose the question in your own voice, or you can use the Q&A function on Zoom, in which case I read your question, but you can get in line now. Our discussant this afternoon is Emily Marker, an associate professor of European and Global History at Rutgers University, Camden, where she researches and teaches about imperial and post-colonial Europe, Francophone Africa, race, religion, youth, and global history. Her recent book, Black France, White Europe, Youth, Race, and Belonging in the Post-War Era, published in 2022, received the George Louis Beer Prize from the American Historical Association. She is the immediate past president of the Western Society for French History, the current president of the Camden chapter of Rutgers AAUP, AFT, a member of the Faculty Advisory Board of Rutgers Center for European Studies, the editorial board of the Journal of the History of Childhood and Youth, the faculty advisory board of the American Friends of the Documentation Center of the Austrian Resistance. Emily, we're glad you could join us this afternoon. Zoom screen, all yours.
Thanks so much. I'm really delighted to be here. This is going to be a really great conversation. I love this book. And so I'm just going to talk a little bit more about Isaac's book. Very pleased that he didn't give a sort of thorough presentation of the book itself, and I get to do that. That's great, and I think that our comments together will inaugurate a great discussion. So, Europe Without Borders tells the untold story of the origins of Schengen, the vast swath of Europe that guarantees free movement to European nationals, and early conflict and contestation over its scale and scope. In 1985, as Isaac has told us, 5 of the 6 original members of the European community signed a treaty in the tiny town of Schengen that would abolish internal borders for its citizens. The Schengen Agreement was part of a wider effort in the 1980s to imagine the European community as something more than a common market and free trade zone, a more robust political and cultural citizens' Europe, after many attempts in the earlier periods of European integration in order to create a robust political and cultural community faltered in the 1950s. So with this relaunch of the cultural and political project of Europe in the 1980s, by 2000, the Schengen area had encompassed almost all of Western Europe, and the Schengen border regime was formally incorporated into EU law. Isaac argues that one of Schengen's most consequential innovations was to extend freedom of movement in the European communities, not only to economic agents, but more simply to persons. In this way, Schengen constituted a cosmopolitan European social space, as well as a place of market exchange. And this is giving a sort of, this is a fundamental shift that's giving a more humanist cast to the market paradigm of European integration. However, he underscores that greater liberty entailed new forms of state surveillance and deepening conflict over the right of border crossing. Crucially, non-Europeans were excluded from the Schengen Agreement. In this sense, Schengen was simultaneously expansive and exclusionary, restricted by citizenship. Schengen ushered in a new security regime, the linchpin of which was the Schengen Information System, which Isaac just presented very thoroughly, which fortifies Schengen's external borders, blocked illegal immigration, and tracked foreigners transnationally. Many Schengen countries tightened their immigration laws into anticipation of the end to internal borders, and/or used Schengen as a pretext to curb the entry of quote-unquote undesirables. And I'll come back to that word in a little bit. Thus, Isaac portrays Schengen as a, quote, system of dualisms, of freedom and security, of unity and exclusion, and of cosmopolitan exchange and national sovereignty. Or put another way, Schengen could be seen alternately as a transnational space embodying the principle of free movement, or a European fortress abridging the guarantee of human rights. So in the early chapters of the book, and I kind of read the book as sort of in 2 parts, Isaac tracks the treaty-making process itself. He makes the compelling claim that Schengen took the form of an intergovernmental treaty without any democratic consultation, precisely because the narrow focus on economic integration in the founding documents of the European communities left no room within community law to extend freedom of movement to persons beyond the realm of economic activity. European statesmen intent on dissolving Europe's internal borders therefore had to turn to closed-door negotiations as a workaround to realize this citizens' Europe, which paradoxically alienated the European populace and heightened anxieties about Europe's democratic deficit, which continues to be a major plank or platform of Euroscepticism today. As he astutely notes, and I quote, secret treaty making both undermined democracy and gave priority to exclusion, making a travesty of free movement and fueling racism. Still, there were counter trends. The EC's 1990 Dublin Convention on Asylum acknowledged a common European humanitarian tradition of welcoming asylum seekers, whereas the Schengen Convention expressly declared a right to exclude, to refuse entry and expel asylum seekers. But there were also counter trends at the national level in response to Schengen's rule, assigning asylum responsibility to countries of first entry. In its constitutional reform of national asylum law, France expressly preserved the power of the nation to grant refuge to any asylum seeker on its territory, regardless of whether or not they had sought asylum somewhere else, whereas Germany gave the nation power to refuse asylum claims if the claimant had passed through another country, Schengen country first. That's the sort of first half of the book. And then in the latter chapters, I think I see Isaac make similar analytical moves with regard to that dualism, pairing a fascinating discussion of the emergence of a new invasive security regime based on transnational cooperation and digital surveillance and mining personal data, with a trenchant analysis of the sans-papiers movement, the people without papers. If Schengen was a laboratory of free movement of people, as its architects claim, Isaac shows how the unrest of the sans-papiers became a laboratory of rival ideas, competing ideas about what freedom of movement really means. Indeed, he shows that it was precisely the condition of non-belonging in Europe that prompted the sans-papiers to claim free movement as a human right in the first place. So in this sense, Isaac offers another compelling counterpoint of Schengen's top-down, undemocratic digital surveillance with the opposing force of what he calls globalization from below, brought on by these undocumented migrants as brokers of a new kind of digital politics. So this reinforces his central claim about Schengen's deep internal contradictions and dualisms, which I think is a really critical intervention in the field. And so now I'm going to move into some comments, and I'm going to try and bring in Isaac as I unfurl them, because I think that, you know, us talking will just be more interesting than me talking. So I think that, you know, for folks who aren't familiar with the literature on European integration, I mean, this book is just a valuable contribution to the scholarship on the EU. The field of European EU studies is lively, it's interesting, it's growing, but it is a peculiar discipline in that it is largely sponsored by the European Union and its institutions, right? So the EU is the patron of this discipline, which, you know, creates some problems in the way that the literature unfolded. And I think that you can really see that a lot of the literature on specific EU institutions is very, very Whiggish. And it is coming from this sort of interpenetration between the sort of world of EU researchers and European institutions themselves. So that's one kind of issue with EU studies as a field, or the sort of literature out there. But there's also this sort of just structural problem of the lumpiness of the process of European integration, which makes studying European integration really challenging. You know, there were a lot of false starts in early European integration. There was a vision that I mentioned or alluded to before of a sort of Europe, united Europe, supranational Europe as a robust political community that falters in the 1950s because of Cold War reasons and also because of colonial reasons. And so when you study the history of European integration, you know, there's a temptation to take the form that the EU took for granted, ultimately takes for granted, whereas, you know, there was a lot of contingency. And a lot of false starts, as I mentioned. When we talk about European integration, also, I think, you know, Kevin Featherstone, political scientist, has sort of separated out two registers of Europeanization. One sort of means, synchronizing national member states in the European communities and ultimately EU, their law and policy to that European level. So that's what he calls like maximalist version of Europeanization, the synchronization of national law with EU rules and policies. And then there's a sort of more minimalist version that is sort of more diffuse and just thinking about the way in which transnational processes in Europe has created an increasing sense of Europeanness that is also associated with the EU in many ways, right? And so I think that what Isaac shows in this book is that, that sort of maximalist version of Europeanization, this legal race exclusion through Schengen of non-EU citizens from the right to free movement. I think you show how, all the member states are synchronizing themselves to make that a reality. And yet on the flip side, in the discussion of the sans-papiers, which is a movement of undocumented migrants that starts in France, but becomes a transnational collective movement across the continent in response to Schengen. You see the sort of civil society actors synchronizing to transnational European trends and realities, right? So I think that's really interesting. I mean, the reason why I was invited into this conversation is my own expertise on colonialism and European integration and the relationship between, trying to democratize post-war Europe and also like turn a page on its colonial and racist past through European integration, which is paradoxical because, of course, that was pursued when most of the founding members of the EEC still had robust empires. So I think that, Isaac is really tapping into a wider discussion and movement among scholars of the EU and Europeanization to think about the colonial origins of the EU and bring the colonial legacies of empire and decolonization into the way we study European institutions. And so, when he shows us that this like turning to a sort of humanist cast on the market paradigm comes at the expense of a racist exclusion, but also what, many scholars like Etienne Balibar will call like a recolonial exclusion, right? Like it is a neocolonial form of exclusion. So maybe on that, I'll ask my first question sort of on that, especially given what I said about the field of EU studies, which is dominated primarily by social scientists who work in a sort of presentist mode, people that work on policy, political scientists, some sociologists. So I think that you bring a sort of twinned outsider perspective as a Oxford-trained historian and also as a journalist. And so I wonder if you could say a little bit about how those two skill sets came together for you in pursuing this origin story of Schengen.
Sure, thank
you.
you.
I have more questions, but that's my first.
That's great. And Emily, it's really such an honor to be in conversation with you on these topics in particular. So, no, it's a terrific question. I'm sitting here in the Washington Post office. Sort of this is my day job. I began this project, the research for this, shortly after Brexit. Really more so in 2017, but shortly after Brexit, and when there were lots of elections on the continent in the Netherlands, France, Germany, that focused in large part on migration, security, terrorism, and the aftershocks of Brexit. And this was this moment when it seemed like there was this populist wave crashing across Europe. That narrative was too simplistic, but in some ways we're still living with that wave. And in fact, the wave has grown more powerful, you could even say. And so in certain ways, the project began as a journalistic project. I was interested in the origins of some of these questions, but it was born out of interviewing politicians and officials and everyday people voting in these contests, roiled by some of these questions. And it got me thinking about Schengen and this system of open internal borders and free movement. And then I realized that there hadn't been a history of Schengen written in large part because there's a 30-year embargo on most diplomatic records. So again, this is like a marrying sort of journalistic instincts and historians' instincts. This is like a historical scoop to be the first person to access some of these records and to be able to, for the first time, tell a kind of comprehensive history of something. And I never saw it, and I still don't see it as a EU history per se, in part because Schengen was negotiated outside of EU institutions until the very end of the 20th century. It wasn't even part of EU law. This was done entirely at the intergovernmental level. So while events within the EU progress toward the single market, foremost among them, but others mattered greatly to the Schengen discussions, and it was considered a laboratory for that kind of process and progress. The thinking that was being done and the figuring out of these concepts and the contests and the debates were happening outside of EU institutions. And centrally among those, this issue of this change in the meaning of free movement, that you go from a economic concept and a commercial paradigm of free movement that arises from the Treaty of Rome, where you're allowing workers to move freely across borders, people engaged in economic pursuits, to a more humanist idea of free movement that at the very same time gives legitimacy to economic integration. So there was keen awareness that to advance progress toward the single market, to make a single market happen by 1992, 1993, you have to provide civic legitimacy to this process. And the way to do that is to extend it from beyond the arena of the market toward a more civic vision. So I became very interested in that switch and what it meant that you went beyond the market paradigm precisely to create legitimacy for primarily economic integration. And again, that was a kind of lineage of the idea of free movement and a history of free movement that was separate from EU studies, from an analysis of how the European Commission operates or how the European Parliament operates, or so on and so forth.
Great, thanks. Well, something else that I wanted to ask you about was the sort of echoes between the sort of current refugee crisis that we've had in Europe that put so much pressure on Schengen since the 2010s and the World War II era, and your mention of Jouffe sort of reignited that for me. I mean, this language of undesirables is really notable for that reason, right? Like, this is the language that was used for Jewish and other Central and Eastern European refugees during in the run-up to World War II in France. And it made me think, as I was reading your book, I kept thinking of a German film by director called Christian Petzold called Transit. That was an adaptation of a World War II era novel. But the way that the film is filmed is, and so it is the story of, a German-speaking refugee first in Paris and then in Marseille trying to get out. But the way that it's filmed is without period infrastructure. So everything is filmed on on the streets of Marseille today. And when there are roundups, they are, French national security police in the riot gear that they wear today. And when they're looking at, sort of spaces where migrants gather, some of them look more like today's refugees than refugees from the 40s. So I wonder if you could speak to sort of the way that you see this echo of the past. I mean, in the book, you frame this as a post-war project to do something different with Europe. And yet, I think in the Petzold's film, you see the striking overlaid these two temporal moments as if they're a perfect continuity. And Schengen seems to be a really important piece of why that's happening now. So I guess I wonder if you have thoughts on that sort of, trans-temporality between the two moments.
Yeah, I think I would say two things about the kind of connection between the past and the present on the refugee question and the question of undesirables. One is that, and this is kind of day-to-day life for people who live in Europe. The kind of madness of the system of the country of first entry, that the country where a would-be or an asylum seeker, a would-be refugee arrives is the country that has authority over that asylum claim, which obviously burdens Greece and Italy and other countries vastly more than Finland or Denmark, Northern European countries. And this is something that European leaders have been wrestling with for years, but especially since the 2015 crisis. And there's been new progress on it, and kind of new system of rules that are being hashed out, I think coming into effect toward the end of next year or this year, and then into 2026. But this principle, the country of first entry, which is codified in the Dublin regulation, actually arises in Schengen. Schengen is a model for this system as they're working out what to do about asylum and national authority as internal borders open. It's developed this system, the country of first entry, and this is ultimately codified in Dublin. So I think this is, again, one of the kind of forgotten imprints of Schengen in the chaos of Europe's system of migration and refugee management. And then the other point on the undesirables, I was also struck by this language, and this was not language that was included in the ultimate treaty. These were part of either diplomatic discussions or these secret annexes, these confidential annexes that listed countries and ranked them according to risk on various metrics as part of developing a visa system. So once you open the internal borders, there was a classification of certain countries whose citizens would be allowed entry for short-term visas based on different sort of standards. And it's striking in a way because I think the popular conception of Schengen and what it allowed in terms of free movement is that it was this humanitarian, liberal vision of essentially letting people in and letting them move. But it's very much not the case. And the negotiators themselves were clear-eyed about this. I had a chance to speak with a number of them. And it was kind of remarkable to hear them just reckon with the kind of security protocols and measures designed at keeping outsiders out that were necessary, and the frankness about the fact that that was part of the point of the agreement. It was designed to create convenience and ease for internal travelers, for citizens of these states, but it made no pretensions about opening things up and offering kind of humanitarian Europe up as this kind of beacon or haven for people to move into and travel more freely. So this, back to the dualism question, it was really stark. And so, yes, it meant speaking of the outsiders in terms of the language of undesirable, because, they were undesirable to this system, which was designed to safeguard freedom and opportunities for European citizens and only European citizens.
Yeah. And I mean, the first entry point issue is actually really important, and to go back to what I was saying about, the colonial legacies of so much of this post-colonial migration that Europe is seeing. In order to get to France, a former citizen from the late colonial empire might be, taking the sea route and trying to get to Italy, right? And so I just wanted to actually read. I mean, you mentioned Cissé, the sans-papiers activist from Senegal, who ultimately had to return to Senegal after leading an uprising of sans-papiers. I just wanted to read a long passage that you have in your book, citing her, because I think that it so poignantly captures this this post-colonial aspect of the story. So I'll just read this for a second. This is on page 239, Isaac's book. I say how France colonized my country of origin, how our countries were impoverished by colonization, neocolonization, how these countries are crumbling under the weight of debt, how these Africans whose relations with the state administration are judged today are treated in this country, how our grandparents had fought alongside French soldiers to repel the Nazi occupation. And I think that so much of that sense of legitimate claims on citizenship, or if not citizenship, at least the right to residence and work in, ex-colonial metropoles does stem from like this service during World War II that, whole generations of colonial subjects and later citizens contributed. So I think that there's like another layer in that echoing between past and present that I find really compelling. And I guess I just wonder if you hear those conversations among folks working in European bureaucracies today, has the needle moved for them, like post 2020? I mean, there's so much more transnational activism that is sort of, drawing on the anti-colonial tradition of descendants of, colonized populations. So I wonder if you see that actually making a dent at all in the way that folks are talking about this, or if this is just, continually sort of brushed aside. I mean, in lots of ways, I mean, we see the ways that it is. I mean, the influx of university students fleeing Ukraine during with the onset of the war there, right? You saw European, West and Central European universities welcome ethnic Ukrainians and refuse entry to the tens of thousands of African and South Asian students that were studying in Ukraine. And that's like sort of the same kind of parallelism that you see in your analysis.
No, I'm really glad you mentioned Ukraine and read that Cissé quote, which comes from when she was pleading her case before the Paris court and then to the European Court of Human Rights. She's detained and then tried on these grounds of being part of this protest and then staying in France unlawfully. And she pleads her case before this Paris court and then before the European Court of Human Rights on freedom of association grounds. And she doesn't win her case, but she doesn't win her case, but interestingly, the court finds that her status of unlawful entry and unlawful residence in France alone didn't justify an infringement on her right to free assembly. So there's a finding that France was justified in breaking up this action and in the expulsion. But as part of this, there's a ruling that there is still a right to freedom of assembly, even if there's this condition of illegality, that she was there illegally. Despite that, she's still afforded freedom of assembly. And I looked into the kind of afterlives of this case, which she loses, but again has this kind of important doctrine that's set forth, and it's actually cited a lot in freedom of association cases, including, quite interestingly to me, in cases arising from the Maidan and the protests at the Maidan in 2014. So, uprisings against Ukraine's pro-Russia authoritarian leader that are violently suppressed. And there are cases that arise from this that are arguing freedom of association. And in the decisions is cited the case, Cissé's case, in which there is a finding of, again, freedom of association is sacrosanct despite these conditions of illegality. So you have the protests of undocumented within Europe coming to vindicate the efforts by those beyond Europe protesting to enter the freedoms and opportunities and guarantees that Europe allows. And I think in light of, the situation in Eastern Europe and Ukraine and Russia today, I found that extremely interesting. So, and again, getting back to your question, I do think that I would say that's how, in some ways, this still lives with us today. I wouldn't say there's a great degree of thinking through of kind of post-colonial debts, but I think there is, in the discussions about Ukraine and debts to parts of Eastern Europe and efforts to prevent Russian revanchism, I think that's where it's used and leveraged in some way.
Great. I was going to ask you to say more about the CC versus France case, but you've done that, so that's great. Maybe in light of time, I'll just ask one last question, which is, I've seen you refer, and you do this in the book and also in an excellent op-ed you had come out in the Times today, refer to Schengen's death by 1,000 cuts. And so I wonder if you could say more about, what has happened and where we're going, if you have.
Yeah, thank you. It's funny, I read some of the comments, which you're never supposed to do, and I ordinarily never do for my reported pieces, because it's, who comments on news articles? Anyway, no offense to anyone who comments. But I read some of the comments and someone said, this is so hyperbolic. I live in Europe and there's still freedom of travel in many places. And that's very much the case. But the piece begins with a moment when I was crossing between France and Germany, and I was stopped because, especially since September, at German borders, there's been a reintroduction of controls, and really across Europe, there has been a restoration of checkpoints in many, though of course not every border crossing. It is still in many places possible to cross without being asked for identification. Within the Schengen Treaty and within the Schengen system, there was an allowance and a possibility of derogating from its terms and reintroducing controls for reasons of national security or public policy. And as I mentioned at the outset, Schengen's member states, the individual nation states, were given a lot of autonomy for how they did this. It does set out certain terms. There has to be, certain reasons, it has to be for a limited period of time, and there's supposed to be advance notice to the other member states. And the kind of wholesale reintroduction of controls, especially in recent months, but going back to the refugee crisis of 2015, into COVID, war in Ukraine, war in Gaza, other shocks in the Middle East, have just meant a kind of wholesale reintroduction of controls. And in some cases, in Germany's case in September, at all of its land borders. So I do think we're moving into a kind of different mode here, where it's not just a spot check because of some security situation, a World Cup or a terrorist attack that means for a 6 weeks period there's a check at a certain border, but a kind of willingness to suspend Schengen at a large scale. I was interested in remarks that Donald Tusk of Poland made, former president of the European Commission, made after Germany's move in September, where he called it unacceptable and said it was this, suspension of the Schengen Agreement on a large scale. It's fascinating to me that Bulgaria and Romania are new entrants into Schengen just as of this year, and already at certain checkpoints they have controls. So they're part of Schengen, but how much does that mean really, if practically speaking, within days of their entrance into the agreement, they have controls? So it's an odd kind of balance and indeterminacy, I would say. I think that the freedom to travel and freedom of movement, opinion surveys show, is really popular among the European populace, even though there has been a kind of backlash to other aspects of European integration, and Brussels, remains hugely unpopular. There's a deep appreciation for what this has meant in terms of the ability to study, work, and travel across borders, but it's also become kind of politically toxic to allow this kind of laxity in a moment of rising concern about immigration, rising concern about terrorism. And Schengen has been a target for the far right, for the National Front in France and other far right parties for years. But it's not far right parties that are acting against Schengen. It's centrist parties. So I think that it'll be interesting to see how far this goes, and especially with what happens with these new refugee rules in terms of the authority for processing asylum claims. But I do think we're in somewhat different territory when we have kind of wholesale reintroduction of checks at all land borders instead of spot checks for particular reasons or events.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We're now going to open this up for discussion. We have a number of folks with hands up, but first, Christian has a question that he would like to pose to get us started. Christian.
Oh, well, first, thanks, Isaac, and thanks, Emily. And actually, Emily's last question preempted mine. So let me ask a different question. We're at a historical seminar here. You're a historian, you're an investigative journalist. Talk a little bit about your sources and how the toolkits you brought to this study. How did you penetrate this information, the security system that you write about?
The book is largely based on archival sources. As I mentioned, there's a 30-year embargo on many diplomatic records. So 1985 or right around then until 2015, 2016, 2017 or right around then, this was just lifting. So in my initial contact with the archives, it was really exciting to be discussing this with them and saying, many of these are just now open and have never been looked at before. Most of the archives are actually with the individual member states because Schengen was negotiated at the intergovernmental level. A lot of the hashing out of the agreement lives with the foreign ministries or internal ministries of the interior in the member states, especially France and Germany, given their leading roles in the negotiations. There's some records in Brussels that I looked at, and also some at the European University Institute in Florence. So archives in France, Germany, Belgium, and Italy formed really the crux of it. And then a range of other treaties and diplomatic material either available online or that I was able to access, say, from the European Court of Justice. I did do a number of oral histories for the book, sort of putting my traditional journalistic practices to work. Fortunately, a number of the Schengen treaty makers, the negotiators, were still living, and I was able to speak to some of them, along with security officials. I talked to an early leader of Europol who was closely involved with the administration of the Schengen information system. And also I spoke to truckers who spent their days driving refrigerators and other wares across Europe to hear from them about what it was like to all of a sudden not have to wait and with these burdensome customs checks. Probably the most fun I had doing an interview was I found there's a cartoon artist that features prominently in the book because there's an important case that she brings to try to vindicate her right to travel across borders and not pay a special fee just levied on foreigners. And it's a case that reinforces the kind of commercial paradigm of free movement arising from the early European treaties and explains why the Schengen treaty makers had to operate at the intergovernmental and go beyond that. So this case of this cartoon artist and that's decided in 1984. And I found her through the Facebook page of the agency or the school that she still works with. And I just sort of cold called her and explained who I was. But this to me is like what I do every single day, every hour. So it's actually more so my practice than, bent over archives. So some of those interviews came quite naturally. And the cartoon artist who I spoke to, she actually drew something for the book, which was also lovely to be able to include her little etching of Schengen, in the pages of the book. So, I was lucky to work on history that both had archival materials and then also some of the people who were instrumental to it were still alive and were able to share their recollections and enliven some of the material because sometimes diplomatic paperwork can be a bit dry.
Thank you. Noor Kazi has had a hand up for a while. If you would unmute yourself, you can pose your question. We need you to unmute yourself. All right. We are going to move on to Thomas Adams. If you would unmute, you can pose a question.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. This is just fascinating and so enlightening. Um, I had just a vague recollection that at the beginning of the Schengen Accords, there was an exception because Germany had some requirements. And I was just wondering if I'm correct on that, whether those exceptions to the original accords set some precedent for the kind of issues that are under discussion here.
What kind of exceptions?
I thought it was involved Eastern Europe and people coming in from Eastern Europe um, that were of concern to Germany. But I must admit that I'm rather vague. I just remember that in the reading about the original Schengen Accords, there were some exceptions made, and I thought on behalf of Germany.
Well, right in the final months of the negotiations over the implementing convention in 1989 and 1990, there was a delay when the Berlin Wall fell in the fall of 1989 because Schengen, it hadn't been anticipated that it would encompass both West and East Germany. It had just been West Germany as part of the agreement. And then the Berlin Wall falls, reunification is anticipated. And all of a sudden there is a need to figure out what this will mean if this extends to a reunified Germany. So that causes a delay in certain stipulations about allowances for German nationals living beyond the Federal Republic. Um, but once it's signed in June 1990, things proceed. There are other concerns, more minor concerns that come up. There is the agreement once it was signed in 1990, then went to the individual member states for ratification to the national, through the national parliaments. That concludes in 1993 with Germany, but then it's another year and a half, 2 years before it actually goes into effect. And that's because certain conditions had to be met about the fortification of external borders, about the operation of the Schengen information system, this expansive data system. So there's a kind of back and forth and a haggling at that point as well about whether each state has met its various conditions. Yeah, so those are sort of two moments when there's question about how quickly or on what terms Schengen is going to go into effect.
Thank you.
Thank you. Leon Fink, please unmute.
Yes, thank you, Isaac. Wanted to ask two related questions, drawing on your expertise. First, you mentioned, as did Emily, the alternatives raised to what seems like a tightening and rather depressing general pattern of restrictions on movement. The alternative coming from the sans-papiers people and the migrants themselves. I wondered if you could expand a little on what their vision is of an alternative Schengen type order for movement and expression. And related to that kind of generally darkening scenario that you paint, I'm wondering, don't think you mentioned it specifically, but I'm wondering how graphically you see the rise of right-wing populism in Europe to this tightening of the Schengen patterns. And in particular, since you're speaking to a U.S. audience, and I understand why you don't want to go, beyond your subject, but I'm wondering if you see any parallels or rhyming between the pattern in Europe and our current situation with undocumented in the U.S. With an imminent, perhaps crackdown on movement within the U.S. of people designated as criminals or just for crossing a border. And if you could comment on that and what you see as possible strategies, counter strategies.
Yeah, thank you for those interesting questions. To take them in order, in terms of the alternative vision, it was a really maximalist vision that the sans-papiers had. It was of free movement as a human right, as an ability to come and go, and a kind of essential personal liberty derived not from citizenship in any one particular European country, but from the condition of being human. And there were appeals to principles from France's Revolutionary era, other kinds of documents going forward, post-war commitments that were made to asylum and otherwise. But it was a maximalist vision. It was not something that they were sitting down at the negotiating table and trying to say, well, what if we just tweaked that one part of the Schengen Agreement to say this instead? But it was a rejection of free movement as a guarantee only for European citizens, and a much broader, more universal vision. The rise of right-wing populism, I think it's, I think that Schengen has been a really useful bête noire for far-right parties. There is a moment just at the end of the book where there's a national front kind of stunt in Schengen, where one of the leaders of the party goes and lays a wreath in Schengen to kind of announce and signal Schengen's death. I think in 2014. And then we also see the way in which the pressure from the far right has certainly caused a clampdown. I think it's absolutely the case that Germany's actions would not be as they are if it were not for the really severe threat posed by the AfD to the more mainstream parties, and a desire to get tough on immigration. And that's true across Europe, and it's true in the US in terms of the kind of rhetoric we saw from both parties in the presidential election. And that takes me to your final question. Obviously, there are so many details that separate the two instances: legal, geographical, diplomatic, and otherwise. But I think the broader structural factors, there really are a lot of parallels, both in terms of the backlash against globalization, the sense that of people that they're being buffeted by these forces, by these strange international forces that they don't understand, the sense, whether real or imagined, that their communities or their countries have become unrecognizable, and desire to do something about that. I think the reaction that we could see here in the US in a matter of weeks now could just be much more extreme than what's on the table in Europe, but possibly a harbinger of what's to come there too.
Thank you. Katrin Schulteis, unmute, pose a question.
Am I unmuted? Am I unmuted yet?
You are indeed.
Okay, great. So my question, I missed the first few minutes of your presentation, so apologies if you've already talked about this, but I'm wondering if you could say something about the extent to which, if at all, you see any influence of thinking about the experience of the Second World War and refugees from the Holocaust I realize, decades later in this Schengen agreement. I'm thinking in particular about this idea that you can't cross from one, if you're coming from the outside, the first place you enter must be the place you stay. The issuing of temporary transitory visas during World War II was ubiquitous, right? And the idea was you can't stay anywhere, you have to keep moving. And this seems to be the opposite of that. So I wonder if you could just reflect a little bit on whether you see any influence in the crafting of the Schengen Agreement of these old issues from the Second World War.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, my sense is that it really operated at the level of rhetoric. But your question and your point about it being the opposite of the way these temporary visas worked, in terms of you stay here, but you can't go, versus these visas saying for a limited period of time, you're in, and now you can move as citizens of these countries do, being different. So that's very interesting. And I would need to think more or even, conduct further research about the way that very concept of the visas arose as a reaction to the way some of this operated during the war and a sense of a desire to move beyond that. What came out of the research was largely, again, that the influence of the war and kind of memories and legacies of the war largely operated at the level of rhetoric. So even though this was in the 80s and a number of decades after the immediate post-war experience, there was this kind of sense in the background that what we're trying to do is unite these countries, move on from a long history of bloodshed and hatred, and come together in terms of as a sort of civic principle, one European people, unite, put war behind us, and make that impossible. And that was certainly a principle of the early federal visions for Europe, the United States of Europe, and other more sweeping ideas that you make war impossible in this way. Then the other interesting moment that legacies of the war come up and of the Holocaust come up is in the ratification debates, because this is all done largely secretly and largely among technocrats at the intergovernmental level. But then starting in 1991, first in France, it goes to the national parliaments for ratification, and all of a sudden there's this spirited public debate about Schengen and about what it means and about its benefits and drawbacks. And especially in France and Germany, where the debates are spirited, the war is such an important touchstone for both sides, really, because the supporters of Schengen argue again that this comes out of a desire to make amends, to join hands as nations, to banish nationalism. But then also critics of the agreement find their own reasons to use the war and to use the Holocaust for their purposes, either arguing that it's a denial of, say, French sovereignty that is so hard fought going back to centuries ago, but also hard fought in the Second World War, and then in Germany in arguments saying that the asylum provisions are too restrictive and that they prevent proper responsibility for refugees. There are references to Germany's obligations that arise from the Holocaust. And those are quite profound and interesting debates that happened in the early 90s.
Thanks. Anne Dayton, please unmute.
Hello, Isaac. Many congratulations on your thesis. This comes to you from Oxford, and it's very nice to see that you've got the book out as well. Could I ask, I missed a few minutes of your presentation, but I wonder if I could ask you about Romania and Bulgaria, because it's not much talked about, but their very late membership and the difficult debates around it seem to me to have left something of a negative image about the EU for its neighboring countries. And I wonder if you feel that the way in which Bulgaria and Romania were treated has, in a sense, undermined the basis principles of trust within the EU, and that it's very unlikely that Schengen is likely to be applied to any new member states in the future.
Well, gosh, I wonder if maybe you would be better positioned to enlighten us on some of the intricacies of
that's a very clever journalist answer, Isaac. No, I'd like to hear it from you.
Well,
we're all worried about trust in the EU, obviously, especially
absolutely.
People or outside. Yeah.
I must say, the more recent enlargements I have followed as a news consumer and person interested in Schengen, but the book sort of doesn't go up into this century largely, other than a bit in the epilogue. And so even the 2004 enlargement in Eastern Europe that then takes several years for those countries to enter Schengen is not a focal point of the book, which is really about origins. So it really focuses on the 80s and the 90s, and then goes back some really far in the past to trace the origins of this. So I really, I am no authority on the internal debates with Romania and Bulgaria and how they were treated. I'm sorry to say, other than I would note just the irony of the fact that just in recent days they were admitted, and already there are temporary reintroduction of controls at these borders. But in terms of the back and forth and the debates, are just kind of beyond the scope of the history that I was addressing here. But if there are particular points that you think have undermined trust, I mean, I would be fascinated to hear more about what those are.
Well, I was only really thinking that, we're talking, and I think it's a pipe dream at the moment about Ukraine's entry, for example, at some decade in the future. But it seems to me that Schengen may have had its day, that it's very much of a treaty that's, as you explained so brilliantly, you're around the core of France and Germany. The British didn't really join in. And that maybe when and if the European Union enlarges, Schengen will be a no-go area, that it really won't be feasible, and that populations won't accept it. And we've talked a little bit about populism already. It's a very big concern on this side of the Atlantic.
I think it's possible, though I also think there are economic constraints and economic imperatives that might make it difficult for countries that sit within the EU to be outside of Schengen, especially in cases like Bulgaria and Romania, where their neighbors are members. So just purely for reasons of, really humdrum things like, customs checks and standards for certain goods and, livestock and veterinarian principles, all these kind of mundanities that matter once you have established that within a certain system, there is a kind of green light for movement. It might be difficult to be outside of that system once you're within the EU because there's a desire to take advantage of its benefits. But that's, I think, where we go back to the death by a thousand cuts concept, is what does it mean to be within Schengen, but have all these exemptions or temporary restrictions at the borders?
Well, that's very perceptive, because we in Britain have discovered to our enormous disadvantages that those seemingly technical arrangements and relating to the single market really do clobber the economy. So you may be right, but I think there's a big dilemma there, a political one against an economic one. But thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to get a question in of my own here, perhaps two. And I want you to talk about the relationship between the negotiations and the Treaty on Schengen and enhanced border security to block the entrance of refugees, migrants, what have you, and the extent to which Schengen is the force that contributes to the modernization of the security apparatus, which any number of your people speak to, making that connection. But I am wondering that, and this asks you to kind of speculate, that absent the Schengen Agreement, if this modernization wouldn't have taken place anyway, given the levels of migration that was increasingly undesired. You have a description of Interpol, for example, in the early 1980s that I just thought was incredible. Interpol's inadequacies, you said, became increasingly apparent to European nations. ... Some of the problems were technical. Interpol was still relying on Morse code as the basis of an expansive radio network when the negotiations began. Behind the transmission of urgent policing priorities sat operators punching telegraph keys by hand. Upgrades were too costly, straining the budget. Interpol, one of your police officials says, was a post office in the early 1980s. So clearly, this is a system and operation that is technologically unsophisticated and not particularly capable of handling the level of immigration that certain political groups wanted it to handle. So would various countries have upgraded their security apparatus and increased the surveillance anyway, absent the Schengen negotiations, just given the numbers, given the threat of terrorism, and the other problems that you mentioned.
Well, anyone familiar with European bureaucracy might think that they might still be operating according to Morse code, if not for this kind of spur to do things differently. No, I think the point is well taken. There were certainly many different incentives to modernize and also to modernize and to fortify, I should say. But I think that Schengen played a number of important roles in moving this along, and I would identify a couple. First of all, just it was a requirement. So to relax internal controls, to realize this agreement, there had to be certain standards met in terms of the fortification of external barriers and people stationed there and various technology and the amount of money spent on these systems. So that's an important one. Then I think also, as Emily mentioned in her remarks, it was an excuse is maybe not the right word, or a pretense, but in anticipation of this, national governments took it upon themselves and used it as a justification to say internal borders are being relaxed. We really need to get our act in gear in terms of, or get our act in order in terms of how we police our borders. Especially in France, this was true. And again, this comes in the context of the rising electoral threat from the National Front. 1986, the National Front comes to power in a French town for the first time. They enter the European Parliament around that same year. And so the end of the 80s, the beginning of the 90s, there is this strong feeling that centrist parties need to get tough on immigration, and that's in large part in anticipation of removing their internal barriers. So I think there's a compliance issue that it was actually a requirement of Schengen, and then there's also just I don't know what the exact right word would be, but a kind of justification or almost like a pretense to tighten things up.
Thanks. A final question, then, if I may, and this has to do with the sans-papiers and the figures that you center in the book as articulating the goals, the visions, the critique of this movement. And there seem to be, and you will correct me here if I'm wrong, two different strains sort of in defense of migrant movement. One is a human rights strain. No one is illegal. That kind of harkens back to a particular set of thought and doctrine. And the other is a more left-wing critique. And so one of your figures, Cisse, you note that she left to study in West Germany. She read Sartre, Lenin, Lumumba, Malcolm X, and Mao. And then she proceeds to become a spokesperson for this movement, highlighting the colonial, post-colonial, neocolonial dimension there. So am I right in seeing these two strains at work here? And fast forwarding to the current moment, does the latter have much currency, given the right-wing populism that seems to be so strong in so many places? Are either of these critiques still persuasive politically or relevant politically?
Well, I'm not exactly sure what you mean about the difference between them. I think there were different strands and different arguments, whether it was Cisse's argument about a kind of universal human right to move, or a Balabar argument about citizenship. I think there are different strands of a kind of common critique of exclusion, of a rigid definition of citizenship, of kind of state policing power. And I think Balabar in particular articulated this. He wrote this essay called "What We Owe the Sans-Papiers," and arguing that France had these debts to the sans-papiers and that they had sort of recreated a different meaning of citizenship in light of their demands about their ability to occupy public space, to protest the wrongs of immigration restrictions, and that these offered kind of new prospects for social transformation and solidarity on a transnational level. Whether they have purchase, I mean, I think that you're right that the political trends are moving certainly in the opposite direction. And, in the US, a majority of voters supported, a candidate who wants mass immigration roundups, which is hardly a vision of kind of protest against state policing power, the ability of immigrants to make demands, to offer different conceptions of citizenship. So I think these ideas are certainly in severe trial and under serious threat. Yeah, so I think that's the kind of clearest way I can say it, is that no, I think we're in a moment of reaction against these ideas. I think that governments both here and in Europe will see a popular mandate to move in exactly the opposite direction. I'm curious what Emily thinks, if she has any view of the way in which subtly these conceptions are still operative or still have purchase.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I mean, we're definitely in a moment of reaction, and policymakers are inclined to go a certain way and think they have public opinion on their side. I mean, I do think that there has also been like a widening awareness of, colonial history, some sense of sort of intergenerational solidarity and accountability for past wrongs among younger politically activated folks. And I do see, sort of networks of activists of color across the continent moving in those veins, like beyond the undocumented, right? You just have a sort of livelier transnational space of activism now in Europe. On the left, and on the right, of course. But I mean, I don't know. I think that, after the fact, in my own book, which is like looking at mainstream sort of politics for European integration and during the late colonial era, I really didn't look at, which ultimately argues that European integration added another level of racist exclusion in post-war Europe. I wanted to look at mainstream figures because it felt like that's where, we really needed to understand structural forms of exclusion. And I didn't look at the far right in the 40s or 50s. And I regret that now, because clearly they still matter. But at the same time, I feel like these things were baked into the European mainstream in the post-war era. And that's why they were able to be so reactivated so easily in these particular crisis conjunctures. So yeah, I think we have our work cut out for us if we believe in the values of freedom, of mobility as a human right, or any kind of legitimate claim on belonging in Europe for these populations that are coming in droves.
Thank you. I'm afraid we have to draw this to a close. There's a lot more we could talk about. The book comes out tomorrow for those interested in reading further, and there's a lot more in it. So with that, I want to say thank you to Isaac, thank you to Emily and Christian. Christian, back to you for final words.
Right. My thanks as well to Isaac, Emily, and of course you, Eric. Just a reminder, please join us on January 27th for The First and Last King of Haiti, The Rise and Fall of Henry Christophe with Marlene Dowd. We hope to see you then. Until then, stay safe, take care, and thanks all for joining us.